The sound of the city streets was muffled by the tension hanging in the air. Jamal, a 16-year-old high school student, walked home from school like he did every day. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the neighborhood. He hadn't noticed anything unusual at first, just the usual rush of people, the hum of cars passing by, and the occasional dog barking. But then something caught his eye: an expensive phone, sleek and shiny, lying face up on the sidewalk near the edge of the park. It was a high-end brand, one that most people could only dream of owning. Jamal hesitated, looking around to see if anyone had dropped it. The street was empty, but there was a small cafe across the road where a few well-dressed individuals were sipping their drinks, talking in hushed tones. Jamal figured the phone must have slipped out of someone's bag or pocket, maybe while they were crossing the street. He bent down, his fingers brushing against the cool surface of the phone, then quickly stood up, looking around once more. There was no sign of the owner. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should he turn it in to the authorities? Or should he leave it in case the owner came back to look for it? He wasn't sure, but he decided to hold on to it for a little while, thinking he could check the lock screen for any contact information. As he tucked the phone into his bag, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The moment Jamal stepped back onto the sidewalk and started walking toward home, the world seemed to change. From the corner of his eye, he saw a man and a woman in business attire walking briskly toward him. They were probably in their mid-30s, their faces showing the stress of a busy day in the city. The man's gaze immediately shifted to Jamal, and his eyes narrowed as he took in the teenager's hoodie and worn-out sneakers. The woman, following closely behind, was scanning the street, looking distracted until her eyes landed on Jamal's bag. Without a word, the man stepped in front of Jamal, blocking his path. Jamal froze, unsure of what was happening. The man looked at him with suspicion in his eyes. "What's in the bag?" he asked, his voice sharp. Jamal took a step back, startled by the sudden confrontation. "It's just my stuff," he said, his voice unsure but trying to remain calm. "I'm just heading home from school." The woman, now standing beside the man, was already looking at Jamal with disdain. "Is that so?" she said, her tone dripping with judgment. "You know, there's a very expensive phone missing from the area, and we know what kind of people typically end up with things they didn't earn." Jamal's heart sank. The accusation hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't even said a word, and already he was being judged. "I didn't steal anything," he replied quickly, his voice shaking. "I found it. It was on the ground over there." The man stepped closer, his face tightening. "Found it?" he repeated. "Really? How convenient. We've been looking everywhere for it, and here you are holding it." Jamal could feel his palms sweating. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. He had done nothing wrong, but the way they were looking at him made him feel like he had. The woman crossed her arms, eyeing him like he was a criminal. "You're lying," the woman said coldly, her voice filled with contempt. "Give us the phone, now." Jamal took another step back, his instincts telling him to get away from these people. He had heard stories of teenagers being wrongfully accused, and he didn't want to become one of those stories. But how could he prove he hadn't stolen the phone? There was no one around to witness what had happened. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice more desperate now. "I swear I found it. Please just ask anyone. I didn't take it." The man, clearly not believing him, pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "We're calling the police," he said, his voice steady and authoritative. "You're going to regret this." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He could already feel the fear creeping in, settling in his chest. He was just a kid, a black teenager, and he knew how the story could end. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, and he couldn't help but feel like he was already being judged, not just by these people, but by society as a whole. It wasn't just about the phone anymore, it was about how he was perceived. How could he get out of this without making things worse? The man was still speaking into his phone, presumably calling the authorities, and Jamal's mind raced with options. He could run, but that would make him look guilty. He could stand there and wait, but he was terrified of what might happen if the police arrived. The woman's eyes bore into him, her gaze unwavering as she waited for the phone call to connect. Jamal's hand hovered near the phone in his bag, a small flicker of panic taking over. Could he prove his innocence? Should he show them the phone's lock screen? But the thought of showing it to them seemed to make the situation worse. There was too much tension, too much fear in the air. And just as Jamal was about to say something else, to try to explain one more time, he saw the flash of blue and red lights approaching. The sirens grew louder, closer, until a squad car pulled up in front of the cafe. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but professional. Jamal's stomach churned. He had never been in trouble with the law before, but he knew this moment could change everything. His heart raced, his thoughts spinning. What would the officers do? Would they believe him? Would they take his side, or would they side with the wealthy couple who accused him? "Everything okay here?" one of the officers asked, glancing at the scene before him. The man quickly gestured toward Jamal. "This kid has our phone," he said, his voice bitter. "We found him with it, and he's claiming he found it on the street. We want him arrested." The woman nodded in agreement, her expression one of utter certainty. "We've been looking for that phone. He's lying. He must have taken it." Jamal's mind was a blur. He opened his mouth to protest, to tell the officers his side of the story, but the words caught in his throat. How could he explain without sounding like he was making excuses? The officers looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. One of the officers stepped toward him, his eyes scanning Jamal's face. "Do you have anything to say, kid?" Jamal took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I didn't steal it," he said, his voice small but firm. "I found it. It was just lying on the ground." The officer glanced at the other, who nodded slightly. The tension hung thick in the air as the officers spoke in quiet murmurs to one another. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, unsure of what would happen next. This was just the beginning. A story of wrongful accusation, of the harsh reality faced by young black men in a world quick to judge. What would happen to Jamal? Would the truth come out? Would the wealthy couple get their phone back? Or would Jamal be the one left to face the consequences of a situation he had never asked for? The clock was ticking, and Jamal's fate hung in the balance. The police were about to make their decision, and Jamal had no idea what would happen next. Jamal stood there, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. His heart thudded in his chest, his thoughts a tangled mess. The officers were now talking quietly to the couple, their voices low but sharp. Jamal couldn't hear every word, but he could tell that the couple was adamant. The woman's face was flushed with indignation, while the man's jaw was tight with frustration. They had already made up their minds about him. The officers were still sizing him up, their expressions unreadable. Jamal shifted on his feet, trying to gather the courage to speak again. But the words stuck in his throat. What could he say that would make them believe him? How could he explain that he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply found the phone lying on the sidewalk, waiting to be picked up? The fear crept back into his chest. He knew all too well that the color of his skin made things harder, that the world wasn't always fair, especially for someone like him. Jamal's mind drifted back to his childhood. He'd grown up in a tough neighborhood, where survival often meant learning to navigate a world that didn't always see him for who he was. His mom had always warned him about how people would look at him differently because he was black, how he would be treated based on assumptions and stereotypes. As a young boy, he hadn't fully understood, but now, standing in the middle of this tense scene, he understood all too well. He could see it in the way the woman's eyes never left him, how the man's voice had a certain edge to it when he spoke. They didn't see a teenager who had simply found a lost item. They saw a threat. The officer who had been speaking to the couple turned his attention back to Jamal. "Where did you find the phone?" he asked, his voice firm, but not unkind. Jamal swallowed hard, his throat dry. He pointed toward the sidewalk. "It was just over there, by the park entrance," he said, his voice wavering slightly. The officer nodded and glanced over at his partner, who was still talking to the couple. They seemed to be debating something, their words too quiet for Jamal to catch. The silence stretched on, each passing second making him feel more like he was being judged, more like he was guilty of something he hadn't done. His fingers itched to grab his phone from his bag and show them the lock screen, to prove that the phone had no connection to him, but he knew that wouldn't help. If they were already convinced he was a thief, showing them the phone wouldn't change anything. "Do you have any ID?" the officer asked, his tone neutral. Jamal nodded quickly and fumbled through his backpack, pulling out his student ID. He handed it over with trembling hands, praying that this wouldn't make things worse. The officer took the ID and scanned it, reading the name and information with a calm expression. Jamal couldn't tell if the officer was convinced by his ID or if he was just going through the motions. His heart raced as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The woman stepped forward again, her eyes fixed on Jamal with an almost disdainful look. "We've been searching for that phone for over an hour," she said, her voice sharp. "You can't honestly expect us to believe that you found it just lying there. There's no way." The officer held up a hand, signaling her to wait. "We're not accusing anyone just yet, ma'am. We're investigating." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a reminder that they had the authority in this situation. The woman seemed to relent, but her face remained hard, her eyes still cold. Jamal felt his anxiety build. The more the officers spoke to the couple, the more he felt like he was being cornered, like he was being painted into a picture he didn't belong in. He tried to steady his breath, tried to remind himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the situation was spiraling out of control. His stomach churned, and his palms were slick with sweat. Every second felt like it was dragging on forever. The officer who had been talking to him looked back at the couple one last time. He turned back to Jamal with a small nod. "We're going to need to check your bag, son," he said, his voice low but firm. Jamal's stomach dropped. The officers were serious now. They didn't believe him. This was happening. He felt his mind race, trying to think of any way to diffuse the situation, to make the officers understand. He had already explained himself. He had told them the truth. But the more they questioned him, the more he realized that in their eyes, his word didn't hold as much weight as theirs. "I didn't take anything," Jamal said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm telling you, I found it." The officer's face didn't change. "We'll see." Jamal felt a mix of fear and anger rising in him. He wanted to scream, to demand that they listen to him, that they stop treating him like a criminal. But he held back. He knew that doing so would only make things worse. He had seen it happen to others, people who got angry, people who protested their innocence too loudly. He didn't want to become one of those stories. As the officer unzipped Jamal's bag and started rummaging through it, Jamal's eyes flickered over to the wealthy couple. They were still watching him, still waiting for the police to confirm what they had already decided. Jamal's fingers curled into fists, and he felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He wasn't just fighting for a phone. He was fighting against the assumptions they had made about him before he even said a word. He was fighting for his dignity, for his right to be seen as more than the stereotype they saw when they looked at him. The officer pulled the phone from Jamal's bag, his face impassive as he inspected it. Jamal held his breath, praying that the truth would come out, that the officers would see that he was telling the truth. But in that moment, everything felt uncertain. Would they listen to him? Would they believe him? Or would they just hand the phone over to the couple, dismissing his side of the story without a second thought? The tension in the air was suffocating. Jamal's entire body felt like it was on edge, each passing moment stretching into infinity. He could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, the murmurs of the people nearby. But it was all distant now, drowned out by the thudding of his own heart. Everything was riding on what happened next. Jamal's eyes followed the officer's every move as the phone was placed on the squad car's hood. The officer was staring at it now, his fingers running along the edges of the device. Jamal's throat tightened, the fear creeping back into him like a shadow. It felt as though everything in his life had led up to this very moment, the moment when he would be judged by those who didn't know him, who had no idea who he was or where he came from. And all it would take was one wrong decision, one misstep, to ruin everything. The woman was still watching him, her eyes cold, calculating. Jamal could feel her gaze, even when he tried to look away. She wasn't just angry, she was disgusted. To her, Jamal wasn't a person, he was a problem, an inconvenience. And in that moment he could see it, feel it in every word they had spoken, in the way they looked at him. To them, he was nothing more than a stereotype, a criminal in waiting. He could feel the tension building inside him, a mixture of anger and helplessness that threatened to boil over. But he held it in. His mom had taught him that losing his temper would only make things worse. In their eyes, he was just another angry black kid looking for trouble. So he stood still, his body tight, trying to keep his cool as the officers continued to scrutinize the phone. Behind him, the sound of footsteps broke through his focus. Jamal glanced over his shoulder to see another officer walking up, a young woman in a navy blue uniform. She didn't say anything right away, but when she reached the group, she gave the officer holding the phone a quick nod and examined Jamal for a moment. Her eyes softened slightly, but it was hard to tell if it was out of sympathy or just professional courtesy. She wasn't involved in the situation, but something about the way she looked at him made Jamal feel like she was trying to assess him from a different angle. Meanwhile, the man and woman kept talking to the officers. Jamal could barely hear them now, but their words were unmistakable. The woman was pleading with the officer, her voice dripping with entitlement. "This kid's a thief, and we need that phone back," she said, her hand waving in the air like she was conducting some sort of orchestra. Jamal's stomach turned at the sheer arrogance in her tone. She didn't even seem to care about the truth. To her, he was guilty simply because of where he came from and how he looked. Jamal took a deep breath, his fingers twitching slightly. He had to stay composed. He had to keep his cool, but it was becoming harder to do so. The officer in front of him was still staring at the phone, examining it like it was some kind of evidence in a crime scene. Jamal wondered if they were going to wipe it down, check it for fingerprints, or run some kind of scan. Maybe they would find something that could make them believe him. Maybe they wouldn't. But the silence was eating him up from the inside. The young officer, who had been standing quietly to the side, took a step toward Jamal. Her gaze flickered over to the couple and then back to him. "Is this the first time something like this has happened to you?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Jamal blinked, confused by the question. "What do you mean?" he asked, still trying to figure out what her angle was. The officer gave a small shrug, as if to say she wasn't sure either, but her expression was one of understanding. "I mean, being accused of something you didn't do. You ever been in a situation where people just assume things about you?" Jamal's heart skipped a beat, the question hitting a nerve deep inside. It was a question he'd had to answer in his mind 1,000 times. The truth was, he had been in that situation before, but never like this, not with the stakes this high. It was one thing to be judged by people at school or in his neighborhood. It was another when the law was involved. "I've had people assume things about me before," he said quietly, the weight of his own words pulling him down. "But I never thought it would be something like this." The officer nodded, almost as if she understood, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she turned back to the other officers and the couple. Jamal watched as she whispered something to the officer who had been handling the situation. It was too quiet for him to make out, but whatever it was seemed to make the officer stop and reconsider for a moment. The couple was growing more agitated. The woman had crossed her arms, her lips pulled tight in frustration. "Why is this taking so long?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "Why is this kid even getting a chance to speak? He's guilty." He took the phone. "What else do you need to know?" The man shot her a quick look, as if trying to calm her down, but his own frustration was visible too. "We don't need to waste any more time," he said firmly. "We have work to do. Just arrest him and let's move on." Jamal felt his chest tighten. He wanted to shout, to yell at them, to tell them that he wasn't guilty. But he kept his mouth shut. He knew better. He had seen too many videos, heard too many stories of young black men being unfairly treated, being silenced, beaten, or worse. He didn't want to be another name in the news, another statistic of someone whose life was destroyed over an accusation. The young officer stepped forward again, her brow furrowed. "We're going to need a few more minutes," she said, her voice more authoritative this time. "We need to run a few checks." The couple didn't like that answer. The woman's voice rose again, sharp and demanding. "You've got enough evidence. We don't need to wait around. We've already told you everything you need to know. This kid is lying, and you're wasting time." Jamal tried to remain calm, but the tension was becoming unbearable. He couldn't help but think about how much this situation reminded him of the struggles his older brother had faced before he was sent away for a crime he didn't commit. The difference then had been that his brother didn't have the same opportunities. He hadn't been able to speak out, to explain his side. Jamal wasn't about to let the same thing happen to him. But it was so hard to stay hopeful when the people who had the power to change the outcome seemed so set on their own version of the truth. The police officer glanced at Jamal one more time, his expression unreadable. Jamal couldn't tell if the officer was on his side or not, but the young officer had given him a slight nod when she had spoken to him earlier. Maybe, just maybe, he would catch a break. But the couple was still relentless, pushing, demanding, forcing the officers to make a choice. The officers stood in a circle, talking amongst themselves now, leaving Jamal alone with his thoughts. The next few minutes would decide everything, and in his gut, he knew that whatever happened, the world around him wouldn't change. He would be stuck in the same place, forced to carry the weight of assumptions, no matter what the outcome was. Would they take the phone from him and accuse him anyway? Would he go home free, or would this moment shape the rest of his life? Jamal couldn't know, but he knew that nothing was certain yet, and everything was still up in the air. The officers continued to huddle together, their heads bent as they talked in low, hushed voices. Jamal could barely make out the words, but he could tell they were debating. The weight of their discussion felt like it was hanging in the air, each second dragging longer than the last. The couple, however, wasn't as patient. The woman had her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her foot tapping impatiently on the pavement. The man was pacing back and forth, his face red with frustration. It was obvious they didn't care about the process. They wanted a resolution, and they wanted it now. Jamal could feel the growing pressure of their expectation, of the stares that were being thrown his way. He stood frozen, his palms clammy, his body stiff with nerves. Every muscle in him screamed for him to do something, to fight back, to explain himself again. But he knew that all of that would be seen as an outburst, something that would only confirm their assumptions about him. He had to stay calm. He had to trust that, somehow, the truth would prevail. But with every passing second, that hope started to fade. The officers finally pulled away from their conversation, one of them stepping forward. Jamal's breath caught in his chest, his mind racing. Was this it? Was this when they would decide whether or not he was guilty? The officer looked at him for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. Jamal couldn't decipher the expression on his face, but there was a subtle shift, a tightening of his jaw that made Jamal uneasy. "We've run the checks," the officer said, his voice low but firm. "The phone doesn't appear to be stolen. There's no record of it being reported missing." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he thought he had been granted a reprieve, a brief moment of relief. But then the officer's gaze flicked over to the couple, whose faces were now flushed with frustration. The woman opened her mouth, ready to speak, but the officer raised a hand, silencing her. "That doesn't change anything," he continued, his voice steady but not unkind. "The woman and her husband are still insisting that you took it." Jamal's stomach twisted. They hadn't given up. They wouldn't stop. He could feel the weight of their accusations pressing down on him, suffocating him. The officers may have checked the phone, but that didn't mean the couple was going to back down. His chances of walking away from this unscathed were growing slimmer by the minute. The man stepped forward, his eyes hard with determination. "I don't care what your checks say," he snapped, his voice sharp and demanding. "That phone is ours, and this kid had no right to have it. He's lying, and we know it. Do something about it." The officer held up his hand again, trying to de-escalate the situation, but the man was relentless. "You're just going to let him walk? Just like that?" he demanded, his voice rising with each word. The young officer, who had been watching the entire scene quietly, took a step forward. Her eyes flickered toward Jamal, then back to the couple. She had been quiet for a while, but now her face showed a quiet resolve. "We're not here to rush to conclusions," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "We have to follow protocol." But the woman wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild with fury, her posture rigid with disbelief. "Protocol," she spat. "Protocol doesn't matter. This kid is guilty. He's lying, and you're all wasting time. You need to do something." The tension between the two sides was palpable now, thick in the air. Jamal could feel his hands shaking, his heart pounding in his chest. Every word they spoke, every demand they made, seemed to pierce him like a knife. They didn't care about the facts, didn't care about the checks, the evidence, the truth. They had already made up their minds. They were ready to make him pay for something he didn't do. The officers exchanged a quick look, and Jamal could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They were trying to hold the situation together, trying to find a way to appease the couple without making a decision they would regret. But the pressure was mounting. The woman's voice continued to rise, her tone becoming more insistent, more demanding. "We're not going anywhere until you arrest him," she said, her words full of venom. "This isn't over." Jamal's stomach churned, his thoughts spiraling. The couple wasn't backing down. The officers were stuck in a hard place, and he was caught in the middle of it all. His mind raced, thinking of every possible way out of this, but all the options seemed impossible. What could he say now? What could he do to prove his innocence when they were so convinced of his guilt? The young officer stepped up again, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, sir, I understand your frustration, but accusations aren't enough to make an arrest. We're still investigating. You'll have to wait." The woman's face twisted in disbelief. "Wait," she echoed, her voice dripping with contempt. "Wait for what? You already know what's going on here. He's guilty." Jamal felt a wave of despair wash over him. He knew what they thought of him, what they believed. To them, he was just a kid from the wrong side of town, someone who didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. He had become the enemy in their eyes, the thief who was trying to get away with something, even though the only thing he had done was pick up a lost phone. And yet, it wasn't just the couple's attitude that hurt him. It was the fact that the officers seemed so caught between duty and pressure. They had the power to decide his fate, and he could feel them hesitating. He could feel the weight of their indecision in every word they spoke, in every glance exchanged. They wanted to make the right call, but they were also afraid of upsetting the couple, of making an error in judgment that could cost them. The silence stretched on, unbearably long, each second, a new layer of tension building in the air. Jamal could feel himself unraveling, the walls closing in around him. He wanted to scream, to say something, anything, to make them see that he wasn't the person they thought he was. But he knew better. His every move was being scrutinized, his every word was being measured, and he could feel the eyes of the officers and the couple all focused on him like a spotlight, burning him with every passing second. The officers exchanged one last look, and Jamal's heart dropped. He couldn't tell what they were thinking, but he could sense that the decision was near. Time was running out. This was the moment when everything would be decided, when the direction of his future would be determined. Would they take his side? Would they believe him? Or would he be swept up in a false accusation that could follow him for the rest of his life? Just as the officers appeared to be making up their minds, a new voice broke through the rising tension. Jamal's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the source of the interruption. A man had appeared at the edge of the scene, his face unfamiliar, but his posture confident. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair neatly combed, and his stride purposeful as he walked up to the officers. At first, Jamal didn't understand who this new figure was. The man seemed out of place, too polished, too composed for the chaotic scene unfolding before them. He approached the officers with a calm, measured tone, his presence almost magnetic as he spoke, addressing the officers first. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. The officers paused mid-conversation, their attention shifting to him, clearly taken aback by his sudden arrival. Jamal felt a surge of confusion mixed with a flicker of hope. Who was this person? And why did he seem so confident, so certain of his next words? The man glanced over at the couple, who now appeared equally bewildered by his sudden appearance. The woman's expression faltered for a moment, but the man didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on Jamal, studying him intently. "Is this the young man in question?" the man asked, his gaze never leaving Jamal's face. Jamal nodded slowly, unsure of what was happening. He was still trying to process a sudden shift in energy. The tension that had been mounting between him, the officers, and the accusing couple now seemed to swirl around this mysterious newcomer like a storm cloud. The man turned back to the officers, his voice firm but measured. "I represent the owners of that phone," he said, his words coming out crisp and sharp, like they were rehearsed. "And I can assure you, this boy has nothing to do with it." Jamal's mind raced. The man was here on behalf of the phone's owners. But weren't the couple right there, standing just a few feet away? His confusion deepened, and the quiet pressure of the moment seemed to lift just a little as the man continued. "The phone in question belongs to a high-profile client of mine," the man continued, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing back on Jamal. "It was mistakenly left behind in the park earlier today. My client has been frantic about it, and we've been trying to track it down. But I've just come from the store where the phone was last located before it was lost, and I'm afraid there's been a mix-up." Jamal's chest tightened. A mix-up. The words hung in the air like an enigma. If this man knew so much about the phone, why hadn't the officers spoken to him earlier? And more importantly, why had this moment come so late? Had Jamal really been that close to being wrongfully accused of something he didn't do? The uncertainty lingered, still holding its grip on him. The woman, visibly shaken now, stepped forward. "What do you mean? A mix-up?" she demanded. "That phone is mine. My husband found it, and we've been trying to get it back ever since. You can't just come in here and say—" The man raised a hand, his voice cutting through her outburst. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, ma'am. That phone was never yours. I've already spoken with my client and verified the details. Your so-called find was an accident. There's no record of it being yours, and I have the evidence to prove it." The couple fell silent, their expressions now a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. Jamal could see the woman's face redden, her lips pressing together in frustration. Her world seemed to be crumbling in front of her eyes, and Jamal could see that for the first time, the couple realized they might not be getting what they wanted. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and the accusation they had aimed at him now seemed less solid, less certain. But the biggest twist was still to come. The man didn't stop there. With a confident, almost predatory glance at the officers, he spoke again, his tone now colder, more direct. "As I mentioned," the man continued, "I have a signed statement from my client verifying everything. In fact, my client told me that the phone had been dropped in the park, and that it had been mistakenly picked up by someone else, someone not connected to the owners." And he paused for effect, letting the silence build. "I have video footage of the actual person who took it." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. Video footage. This was suddenly no longer just an accusation. It was starting to sound like evidence, but something didn't sit right in his gut. Who was this man? How had he gotten his hands on footage so quickly? And why hadn't the couple mentioned anything about this before? The officer who had been handling the case turned to the man, now clearly interested but still cautious. "Video footage?" he asked, his voice a little more skeptical now. The man didn't hesitate. He pulled out a small tablet from his bag and unlocked it with a few swift taps. The screen blinked on, and Jamal felt his stomach drop as the footage began to play. It showed a blurry figure in a hoodie walking away from the park bench where the phone had been left, a figure that didn't look anything like Jamal. In fact, the person on the screen was taller, older, and had a different build entirely. Jamal's mind reeled. Who was that? The moment he thought the situation was beginning to resolve, it had taken another turn. This wasn't just about the couple's false accusation anymore. There was something bigger at play here. Someone else had taken the phone, someone Jamal didn't know, and they were framing him in the process. The woman's eyes darted between the tablet and the officers, her expression now one of panic. Her grip on her purse tightened, and Jamal could see the shift in her demeanor. No longer was she a woman accusing a teenager. Now she was just another person caught in a lie, her anger replaced by fear. The couple had no more leverage. The balance of power had tipped for good. And yet, even with this revelation, the story wasn't over. Jamal knew that his name had been dragged through the mud, and his reputation, for a while, might be forever tainted. The false accusations had already done their damage, and no video footage could undo the hours of humiliation and fear. But at least for now, it looked like he wasn't going to be arrested. Still, there was something unsettling about all of this. Why had the man shown up so conveniently? Why had the officers not been aware of this footage? Jamal felt an uneasy chill creep down his spine as he realized the stakes were even higher than before. This wasn't just about the phone anymore. There was something bigger at play, and he had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. The tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and Jamal could feel his heart racing as the video continued to play. The blurry figure on the screen walked away from the park bench with the phone in hand, their face partially obscured by the hood. The officers, the couple, and even Jamal himself were all riveted by the footage, but something about it didn't sit right with him. It all seemed too convenient, too neatly tied together, like the man in the suit had just swooped in with the perfect evidence at the perfect moment. The woman's face twisted with frustration, her anger now bubbling over into something more dangerous. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, almost to herself. But Jamal could hear her, and it was clear she wasn't going to let this go easily, not when she had already gotten so close to making him pay for something he hadn't done. The man in the suit stood tall, his expression calm as ever. "There's nothing more to discuss," he said, his voice final. "The phone is accounted for, and my client will be receiving it back. The matter is resolved." Jamal exhaled, his body still tense. He wanted to believe that this was it, that the nightmare was over. But the couple wasn't done. The woman's eyes burned with a mixture of disbelief and anger as she stepped forward, her voice trembling with indignation. "Do you think you can just waltz in here with your fancy video and make everything go away?" She spat. "My husband found that phone, and I'm telling you, it's ours. No one is taking it from us. Not you, not anyone." Jamal's stomach churned. She was still clinging to her narrative, even in the face of the evidence. And the man in the suit wasn't done yet, either. He glanced at the officers, and then back at the couple with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can hold on to that belief if you want," the man said, his voice colder now. "But you be wise to consider what I've just shown you. You were wrong. And trying to force someone else to pay for your mistake isn't going to end well for you." The woman's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her husband stepped forward, his posture stiff as a board, trying to regain some sense of control over the situation. But the man in the suit didn't give them a chance to respond. He turned his back to them, dismissing them with a single wave of his hand. Jamal felt a sense of relief wash over him. It seemed like this chapter was finally over, that the danger had passed. The officers seemed to have accepted the man's explanation, and the couple was retreating into silence, that earlier bravado now deflated. But just as Jamal thought he could breathe easy, the officer who had been quiet the whole time spoke up. "I think it's time we take a closer look at who really owns that phone," the officer said, his voice surprisingly stern. Jamal turned to face the officer, his heart thudding in his chest. The man in the suit's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a crack in his composure. "What do you mean?" the man asked, his voice tense. The officer didn't flinch. "We're going to take a look at the full records, make sure everything checks out. There's something that doesn't add up, and I'm not leaving here until we get all the answers." Jamal's breath hitched in his chest. What was happening? Why was the officer bringing this up now, when everything seemed to have been cleared up? The man in the suit tried to keep his cool, but the strain was visible in his eyes. He took a step back, his eyes flicking toward the officers as if considering his options. "You're wasting time," the man said, but there was an edge to his voice now. "The phone has already been claimed." "I think you're mistaken," the officer replied coolly. "You see, it's one thing to show us footage of someone picking up a phone, but it's another thing entirely to claim it's your client's. We need a full chain of evidence, and right now, there are too many unanswered questions." Jamal's mind was spinning. The officer's words hung in the air like an accusation. Was there something wrong with the footage? Something the officer had noticed that Jamal hadn't. And then, as if the tension couldn't rise any higher, the officer pulled out a small device from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. It was a phone, but not just any phone. It was the same one that had been shown in the video. The officer tapped a few buttons, and then the device pinged with a confirmation. Jamal's heart sank. The phone was still locked, but the officer's next words sent a chill down his spine. "This phone," the officer said, his eyes scanning the crowd, "is not registered in the name of anyone associated with the couple, and it certainly doesn't match the client the man in the suit claims to represent." The man's face twisted, the calm facade he'd maintained slipping away entirely. "That's impossible," he shouted, taking a step toward the officer. "That phone belongs to my client. End of story." But the officer wasn't backing down. He placed the phone on the table in front of them, tapping it again. This time, the screen lit up, showing an entirely different name on the lock screen, one that matched neither the couple nor the man's story. Jamal's head was spinning, the pieces finally starting to click together. The phone wasn't lost by the couple at all. In fact, the phone had been planted there. Someone had intentionally set up the entire scenario to accuse him, framing him in the process. His breath caught as the man in the suit suddenly seemed to realize the game was up. The officer turned to Jamal, his expression softening. "Looks like you were right all along," he said, his voice no longer laced with doubt. "This phone doesn't belong to anyone here." The man in the suit was backing away now, his face flushed with panic. He turned to the officers, his voice trembling with desperation. "You don't understand. You don't know who you're dealing with." But it was too late. The officers had already pieced together the truth. The man wasn't working for some high-profile client. He was part of a scheme, a setup to falsely accuse Jamal in order to hide the fact that the phone had been stolen from someone else entirely. Jamal's knees felt weak as the truth hit him. The man in the suit had orchestrated the entire thing, manipulating the couple and the situation to his advantage. But now, as the officers moved in, it was clear that Jamal had been nothing more than a pawn in a dangerous game. As the officers placed the man under arrest, Jamal stood still, his mind reeling. He had survived the ordeal, but at what cost? His reputation had been tarnished, his trust in the system shaken. Yet, there was one undeniable truth: he was innocent, and for the first time in hours, Jamal finally felt the weight on his shoulders start to lift. As the officers placed the man in the suit under arrest, Jamal could barely comprehend the whirlwind of events that had unfolded. His heart was still pounding in his chest, but the weight of fear that had gripped him for hours was slowly beginning to lift. The tension in the air started to dissipate as the officers handcuffed the man and read him his rights. Jamal watched the whole process, the surreal feeling of the moment making everything seem almost dreamlike. How had it all come to this? The couple, who had once been so certain that Jamal was the thief, now stood silent and defeated. The woman had tears in her eyes, her earlier fury replaced by a quiet, palpable shame. Her husband, on the other hand, was speechless, his face pale as he watched the officers close in on the man who had deceived them all. They had been manipulated into thinking Jamal was guilty, and now the reality of their own mistake was settling in. Jamal didn't know whether to feel sorry for them or just relieved that it was over. After all, they were the ones who had initially accused him of stealing, assuming that a black teenager like him must be guilty. It wasn't hard to see how easily they had been convinced, how the man in the suit had played them, using their own biases to his advantage. But in the end, it wasn't Jamal who had been the real thief. It was the man they'd trusted to find the phone. The officer who had been most involved in the investigation walked over to Jamal, his expression more sympathetic now. "I'm sorry for the way this played out," he said, his voice softer than before. "We should have taken a closer look at everything from the start. I know it's been a rough time for you." Jamal nodded, his mind still swirling with questions. How had the man in the suit pulled this off? What was his true motive? But now, as the officers took control of the situation and began to piece together the details, Jamal knew those answers would come later. For now, he was free, and that was what mattered. "Thank you," Jamal said, his voice hoarse. He wasn't sure who he was thanking, the officers, the man in the suit for finally being caught, or perhaps just the universe for letting him go. "Don't mention it," the officer said, giving him a reassuring smile. "We'll make sure the truth gets out. I'm just glad we were able to clear this up before it went any further." The officer turned to give some instructions to his colleagues, and Jamal found himself left standing alone, watching the chaos slowly fade away. He wanted to walk away, to put this whole ordeal behind him, but something nagged at him. He couldn't forget the couple. Their accusations had nearly ruined him. The damage had been done. His reputation had been tarnished, and even if everything was cleared up now, the memory of what had happened would linger. What about all the others like him, who weren't lucky enough to have this kind of resolution? Jamal's thoughts drifted as he stood there, his mind not entirely focused on the officers or the couple anymore. He thought about how quickly a single moment could change everything. The simple act of finding a lost phone had turned his life upside down. If he hadn't taken that phone, would his life have been the same? Would he have been another young black man caught in a lie, in a system that saw him as guilty before innocent? It was a harsh reality, one that he didn't have all the answers to, but he knew he wasn't the only one facing it. He thought about the stories he had heard, the countless others who had been wrongfully accused, judged, and silenced. And for the first time, he realized something else. This wasn't just about a phone. This was about trust, about the way people were too quick to assume the worst based on nothing but assumptions and prejudices. The officers eventually finished their paperwork and began to escort the man in the suit out of the park. The couple, still in a state of disbelief, began to walk away, their shoulders slumped in shame. Jamal could hear them muttering to each other, but he didn't care to listen. He had his own thoughts to work through. As he stood there, alone in the now quiet park, Jamal felt the weight of everything he had been through. The days of uncertainty, the fear of being wrongfully accused, the shame that had been heaped on him for something he hadn't done, all of it had taken a toll on him. But in that moment, he also felt a sense of relief. Not because the problem was solved, but because he had survived. The world wasn't perfect. Things weren't fair. But in the end, Jamal had learned something important, that no matter how hard things got, no matter how unfair life seemed, he could make it through. He could keep pushing forward, even when everything seemed to be stacked against him. As Jamal walked away from the scene, he thought about the future. This experience had opened his eyes to the realities of the world around him, to the biases that people didn't even realize they carried with them. But it had also given him a new sense of purpose, a fire inside that wouldn't be easily extinguished. He couldn't change everything overnight, but he could make a difference, one step at a time. He realized then that his story was more than just a tale of one wrongfully accused teenager. It was a reflection of something much larger, something that went beyond race, beyond privilege, and beyond assumptions. It was a reminder that the world could be unjust, but it was also filled with people who cared, who were willing to fight for what was right. Jamal took a deep breath as he walked away from the path. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue across the sky. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could face it, no matter what. And that feeling, the feeling of having his truth finally recognized, was more than enough. As Jamal disappeared into the distance, the story of his day would linger in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. But for him, it was just another chapter in his life, one that he had survived, and one that would shape him for years to come.